Welcome back. Now we're going to be talking about Theodore Lowi's attack again on David Truman, or his debate with David Truman, and talking about this idea of this competition between interest groups. As your authors say, Lowi condemns the group system and calls for return to what he calls judicial democracy. Lowi's scathing critique, again, this is the author's wording, not mine. Lowi's scathing critique continues to dominate debate over the future of the American political system. Right? Lowi calls this judicial. He advocates more judicial democracy. So he has, in the essay, is structured almost as an indictment, or as a not a court opinion, but as a legal indictment, and he has the 4 counts against the ideology, 4 counts against the this liberal perspective. And again, liberals, we don't mean necessarily Democrats, right? Nelson Rockefeller, as you know, was a liberal. We're talking about this idea of interest group liberalism, right? As Truman talked about the institutions of our government, he said were interest group based, and Lowi says no, that's not an accurate description. So again, he talks about this corruption of the modern democratic government with the emergence of interest groups. And so he has these 4 counts that are organized in the essay. The first one, he talks about how liberal interest groups, because they're always asking for something and always trying to get resources, corrupts democratic government. And he goes on to quote on page 254, liberalism promotes popular decision making, but derogates from the decisions so made by misapplying the notion to the implementation as well as the formulation of policy, right? So when we have people talk in terms of the poor implementation of the unemployment or the COVID-19 relief to some individuals, right? Well, again, the interest groups don't take on any of this implementation process, and so it makes the democratic institution look bad. He goes on, the liberal practices reveal a basic disrespect for democracy. Liberal leaders do not wield the authority of democratic government, and with the resoluteness of men certain of legitimacy in their positions and the integrity of their institutions or the justness of the programs they serve. And again, when we see as the protests of the summer of 2020, you have mayors who basically have been the commanders-in-chief of the police departments, and they have gone along with either the police union or with other lobbying groups to what they call the militarization of police forces. And so these now, during the summer, these mayors who have been democratically elected to basically represent those citizens in the city hall, they have now moved almost against their own police forces. Now, in some cases, that may be the correct thing to do. I'm not judging. I'm just, again, trying to show you what Lowi's talking about when he talks about this irresoluteness, this lack of responsibility to say, I'm the mayor, I'm the commander-in-chief of the police, I was the one who, right, and not let things like CHOP in Seattle or other institutions where you have basically anarchy. Interest group liberalism renders government impotent. Liberal governments, this is the second indictment, right? Liberals are copious in plans, but irresolute in planning. 19th century liberalism was standards without plans. This was an anachronism of the modern state. But 20th century liberalism turned out to be plans without standards, which is an anachronism too. They die only in combat over the minds of men, and no doctrine yet exists capable of doing the job. All popular alternatives are so irrelevant, helping to explain the longevity of interest groups' liberalism. Barry Goldwater's most recently proved irrelevance of one of the American Union suggests the irrelevance of others. The Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, provide illustrations but hardly exhaust illustrations of such impotence. Here clearly one sees how liberalism has become a doctrine whose means are at its ends, whose combatants are its clientele, and whose standards are not even those of the mob, but worse, are those of the bargainers, fashioned to fit the bargain. Delegation of power has become alienation of public domain, the gift of sovereignty to private satraps. The political barriers to withdrawal of delegations are high enough, but liberalism reinforces these through the rhetoric of justification and often even permanent legal reinforcement. Again, Lowi's a radical. Lowi is talking in terms of this idea of the legal structure reinforcing oppression. Public corporations justly, oddly as efficient planning instruments, permanently alienate rights of central coordination to the directors and those who own the corporate bonds. Or as Walter Adams finds, the most pervasive method for alienating public domain is the certificate of convenience and necessity or some variation thereof in the form of an exclusive franchise license or permit. So again, he's talking in terms of this idea of a corporation, right? So Lowi's saying you use these corporations and you use these legal devices to prevent the democracy that you so claim to honor. In the third indictment, he calls interest group liberalism demoralizes government because liberal governments cannot achieve justice. The question of justice has engaged the best minds for almost as long as there have been notions of states and politics. Certainly ever since Plato defined the ideals as one in which the republic and justice were synonymous. And since that time, philosophers have been unable to agree on what justice is. But outside the ideal, in the realms of actual government and citizenship, the problem is much simpler. We do not have to define justice at all in order to weigh and assess justice in government, because the case of liberal policies, we are prevented by what the law would call a, quote, jurisdictional fact. In the famous jurisdictional case of Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice Marshall held that even if all the justices hated President Jefferson for refusing to accept Marbury and others' midnight judges' appointments by Adams, there was nothing they could do. They had no authority to judge President Jefferson's actions one way or the other, because the Supreme Court did not possess such jurisdiction over the president. In much the same way, there is something about liberalism that prevents us from raising the question of justice at all, no matter what definition of justice is used. Liberal governments cannot achieve justice because their policies lack the sine qua non of justice, that quality without which a consideration of justice can even be intimated. Considerations of justice in or achieved by actions cannot be made unless a deliberate and conscious attempt was made by the actor to derive his actions from a general rule or moral principle governing such a class of acts. One can speak personally of good rules and bad rules, but a homily or a sentiment like liberal legislation is not a rule at all. The best rule is one which is relevant to the decision or actions in question and is, in general, the sense that is involved with have no direct control over its operation. A general rule, hence, a priori, any governing regime that makes a virtue out of avoiding such rules puts itself totally outside the context of justice. Take the homely example of the bull in the china shop. Suppose it was an op art shop and that we considered op worthy of the junk pile. That being the case, the bull did us a great service, the more so because it was something we always dreamed of doing, but were prevented by law from entering and breaking. But however much we may be pleased, we cannot judge the act. We can only like or dislike the consequences. The consequences are haphazard. The bull cannot have intended them. The act was thoughtless, an animal act which bears absolutely no relation to any aesthetic principle. We don't judge the bull, we only celebrate our good fortune. Without the general rule, the bull can reenact his scene of creative destructive daily and still not be capable of achieving, in this case, an aesthetic justice. The whole idea of justice is absurd. Again, you may support the looting that we saw in the summer of 2020. You may reject that looting that we saw in 2020, right? But it has nothing to do with justice. You're looking at the consequences. The general rule ought to be a legislative rule because the United States espouses the ideal of representative democracy. However, that is merely an extrinsic feature of the rule. All that counts is the character of the rule itself. Without the rule, we can only like or dislike the consequences of the governmental action. In the question of whether justice is achieved, a government without good rules and without acts carefully derived therefrom is merely a big bull in an immense China shop. So again, Lowi is posing a question. We've heard many chants, we've heard people talking about this idea of justice outside the rule of law. Justice does not exist outside the rule of law. And again, when you press people and when you ask them to define what is justice, right, they come back basically to the same answer, I'll know it when I see it. And so many of them talk about the neo-Marxist or the Marxist idea of economic justice. Many talk about having some sort of category of either political or sociological reform. Well, again, are these people without rule of law? How can you have justice? Is it just the big bull in a China shop, as Lowi talks about? And finally, the fourth indictment of this sort of liberal lobbying group is that he goes directly at Truman. Interest group liberalism corrupts democratic government in the degree to which it weakens the capacity of governments to live by democratic formalisms. Liberalism weakens democratic institutions by opposing formal procedures with informal bargaining. Liberalism derogates from the democracy by derogating from all formality in favor of informality. And this again, you sort of see this with in the mid-60s when people are talking about, oh, the old, right, the old, get rid of the old, we need to reform politics, get rid of these things, and what do they replace it with? That is always the big question. Yes, change, but change for what? Change how? And he goes, liberalism degrades from democracy by degrading all informality in the favor of informality. Formalism is constraining playing it by the book, is a role often unpopular in American war films and sports films, precisely because it can dramatize personal rigidity and the plight of the individual in collective situations. Because of the impersonality of formal procedures, there is inevitably a separation of the real world between the forms and the realities. And this kind of separation gives rise to cynicism. For informality means that some will escape their collective fate better than others. There has a consequence always been a certain amount of cynicism toward public objects in the United States. And this may be to good, since little cynicism is the father of healthy sophistication. However, when the information is elevated to a positive virtue and hard-won access becomes the share of official authority, cynicism becomes distrust, and it ends in the reluctance to submit one's fate to the governmental process under any condition, as in the case of the United States in the mid-1960s. He's talking about the draft, he's talking about some other institutional historical events in the 1960s. And we see this today. We see this kind of cynicism, we see this kind of distrust. The government could say, well, just this whole idea of wearing a mask for COVID-19 as a political or a question is one of those things that I find personally mind-boggling. And so, again, we deal with the scientific method, but if you don't have formality, if you don't have a method, then you have nothing. That's basically what he's saying. He goes on, public officials more and more frequently find their fates paradoxical and their treatment at the hands of the public fickle and unjust, when in fact they are only reaping the results of their own behavior, including their direct and informal treatment of the public and the institutions through which they serve the public. The more government operates by spreading the access, the more public order seems to suffer. The more public men pursue their constituencies, the more they seem to find their constituencies alienated. Liberalism has promoted concentration of democratic authority, but deconcentration of democratic power. Liberalism has opposed privilege in policy formulation only to foster it, quite systematically in the implementation of policy. Liberalism has consistently failed to recognize, in short, that in a democracy, forms are important. In a medieval monarchy, all formalisms were at the court. Democracy proves, for better or worse, that the masses like that sort of thing too. Again, when people talk about President Trump not acting presidential, right? People like the fact that there is some formality to the presidency. People would like the fact that they would like to see our governmental leaders not be, the leadership of the House of Representatives, Speaker Pelosi, or the leadership of the Senate would not be so personal in their attacks, right? So you have Trump being personal, Mitch McConnell being personal, and Nancy Pelosi being personal, instead of talking about some policies, some efforts of what they're going to implement and what kind of problems are they going to solve. No one's ever talking about solving any problems. They talk about how the other guy is not solving any problems. He goes on, another homely parable may help. In the good old days, everyone in the big city knew that traffic tickets could be fixed. Not everyone could get his ticket fixed, but nonetheless, a man who honestly paid his ticket suffered, in some degree, a dual loss: his money and his self-esteem for having so little access that he couldn't get his ticket fixed. Cynicism was widespread. Violations were many, but perhaps it did not matter, for there were so few automobiles. Suppose, however, there is an automobile population increase, a certain city faced a traffic crisis, and the system of ticketing fixing came into an ill repute. Suppose a mayor, victorious on the traffic ticket, decided that, rather than eliminate fixing by universalizing enforcement, he would instead reform the system by universalizing the privileges of ticket fixing. One can imagine how a system would work. One can imagine that some sense of equality would prevail, because everyone could be made almost equally free to bargain with the ticket administrators. But one would find it difficult to imagine how this would make the total city government more legitimate. Meanwhile, the purpose of the ticket would soon have been destroyed. Traffic regulation, fortunately, was not so reformed, but many other government activities were. The operative principles of interest group liberalism possess the mentality of a world of universalized ticket fixing. Destroy privilege by universalizing it. Reduce conflict by yielding to it. Redistribute power by the maximum of each according to his claim. Each according to his claim. Reserve an official place for every major structure of power. Achieve order by worshiping the processes as distinguished from the forms and the procedures by which order is presumed to be established. Many of you have been in meetings, I have been in meetings, that they're having a meeting because the process dictates that they have a meeting, but you know all the decisions have been made outside of that meeting. It's just a waste of time. And the more, once you enter professional world, the more and more you'll see this. If these operative principles will achieve equilibrium, and such is far from proven that it will, democracy will have disappeared, because all of these maxims are founded upon profound lack of confidence in democracy. And this is something that I really hope that you think about as we go and deal with the crises of our times. Democracy fails when it lacks confidence in its own authority. We have seen governors, mayors, presidents, congressional leaders who have been elected by the processes and the procedures that we vote, and they basically lack the confidence of their authority. They lack the confidence of their oath of office, which is to defend the Constitution, especially when you look at their actions. Democratic forms were supposed to precede and accompany the formulation of policies so that policies could be implemented authoritatively and firmly. Democracy is indeed a form of absolutism, but ours was fairly well contrived to be an absolutist government under the strong control of a consent building prior to taking authoritative action in law. What he's saying, again, is you would have the procedures of a congressional vote, right? And then we could judge the congressional people on if we like their record or not. Of course, the Congress doesn't vote on anything. And so we don't know what their record is. So how can we judge? What kind of criteria do we have when we vote for members of Congress? And he goes, again, whether it be called creative federalism by President Johnson, cooperation by the farmers and local autonomy by the Republicans, or participatory democracy by the New Left, the interest group liberal effort does not create democratic power, but rather negates it. So again, this is a perspective from the progressive or the radical left, but you could also interpret this as a anti-liberal or a conservative take, but of course it's not. But you could interpret that, right? So again, this idea of bargaining, this idea of informality when it comes to the public policy process, you can never put your finger on who is responsible for either A, the policy process or the idea of the policy, or B, the implementation of it. So again, during this time of the taping of this, we've had several crises and a pandemic, and also a crisis coming from the actions of enforcement of law and the police and race relations. And so we have a discussion, and we have these policy proposals, and no one ever can say whose idea is this, right? So the idea that people would be getting relief in the form of unemployment insurance during the COVID-19 pandemic, or this idea of defunding the police, no one takes credit. We don't know who the author of these things are. It's all hearsay, or it's all an echo chamber by the media. And so what happens is, because democracy, we don't know who to blame, or we don't know who to give credit to, what happens is that there's a cynicism that grows. And so people don't see the value of voting. People don't see the value of participating in our system of government. And so this is where we are, right? So you have this idea, one essay sort of rewards and says, yeah, it's great that we have these, we are a democracy because we have these different lobbying groups participating, and all of us are members of these lobbying groups. And we have the counter essay that says, no, basically this kind of deal making and this kind of public policy process delegitimizes democracy and the voter, as it is argued. So that is the lobbying unit. In the next essay, we'll be considering how lobbyists, political parties, and elections get our members of Congress. And so we'll start talking about how Congress works in the next session. Stay safe.